Welcome to another Museum FAQ video. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator at POW, Paul Orselli Workshop, here on Long Island. And I'm delighted to be joined by two guests today, not just one, two. Maybe our topic is so important we need two guests. And I always like to start out giving the guests an opportunity to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their backgrounds, because I think that's always interesting to know how people arrived at the place they are now. Usually, if they're museum people, it's not always a straight path. It's sometimes a circuitous path, but we'll find out. So Taylor and Sierra. Taylor, why don't you start with the introductions, and then we'll throw it over to Sierra to introduce herself.
Yeah, so I'm Taylor Koczot. I am currently a museum educator, freelance museum educator in New York City. I work at a couple of different institutions. Currently, I'm at the Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine and MoCA, the Museum of Chinese in America, but I've worked at other institutions around the city. And I am originally from Louisville, Kentucky, and then I lived in Memphis, Tennessee for 5 years, going to college and also working at a museum there, and then moved to New York to attend Bank Street College of Education to get my master's in museum education. And so I had a pretty straightforward path. Pretty much out of undergrad, I knew what I wanted to do and moved to New York to do it. Lots of museums here. I think it's definitely the place for that. So
oh, that's awesome. Well, and lots of Bank Street grad students find their way to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, since it's right nearby. So there we are.
That's true.
Thank you. And Sierra, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background before we launch into the main part of the conversation.
Definitely. My name is Sierra Van Ryck. I'm the Education Programs Manager for Poster House. This is a brand new poster museum in the United States. We just celebrated our first year in June. My path is very similar to Taylor's. I am Jersey native, born and raised, and just took a quick hop over into the city to do my graduate degree at Bank Street, getting a master's in museum education. From there, I've interned at a couple of different locations. I've worked at a bunch of museums in the city, and the city being New York City, of course. And
what other city is
what
there?
other city is there?
No, we don't want to go there.
We don't want to. I don't want to cause any conflict.
I don't need bad comments on the YouTube.
I do realize that now that I'm expanding outside of my New York bubble, that I have to like specify what the city is. But yeah, I've done some time in some museums in New York City, and I'm happy to be here chatting with you, Paul.
Well, that's great, and we all coincidentally have a Bank Street connection, because I taught there for a number of years. So, and you both are graduates of the museum education program. That's awesome. So I thought that there has been a lot of talk, obviously, in the wake of the interlocking set of interesting circumstances going on in the world, not only a pandemic and an economic crisis, but a social and justice crisis going on in the United States and worldwide, and certainly people involved in museums and cultural organizations have come to the realization that even though we might like to go back to some rosy past or near past, that's probably not in the cards realistically. So I thought it would be really interesting to speak with a couple of museum folks who are earlier in their careers, who have a more vested interest in both short-term and long-term futures of the museum business. And so I just was really interested to, maybe we could start out, Sierra, to hear maybe we could start out first with short-term concerns. What your short-term concerns, each of your short-term concerns are for the museum business, and what you think the museum business should be doing, could be doing better. So let's start there, and then we'll launch into long-term. So Sierra, why don't you? That's a good, nice, big, vague,
Yeah.
Or as we say at Bank Street, I've given you a useful, advanced organizer. So
yes. That's a great question, and I think that what we're really seeing online right now are the short term really popping up. The big ones are layoffs. We are seeing mass layoffs across the country, internationally, at museums and cultural institutions. And we are seeing that, even with endowments, even with, donor support, even with, fundraising campaigns that museums are struggling to keep their staff on, whether it is freelancers, full-time staff, we're starting to really see that kind of come up. We're also still having this really big conversation around what folks are getting paid in museums. It's a short-term conversation because especially now more than ever, you want to make sure that you're getting paid. But we're also still seeing that issue of, the money is not there. People are struggling to make it all happen. And then I think one of the other short-term issues is, the students. We're having big conversations. I'm currently very into museum Twitter right now. If you're not on it, please join. But one of the big conversations are for folks who are currently in museum studies or were just considering applying to museum studies programs. It looks real bleak. You're looking at some of the things we just talked about in terms of like museum jobs disappearing rapidly for folks who are already employed in the field. And then you're also following that up with the looming issue of unpaid internships, the other larger academic issue of student loans, and many people have taken out loans to participate in these programs to take on museum work. And, they're asking current museum professionals and museum leadership, what do I do now to prepare for the field? Do I stay in the field? And quite honestly, people just don't have answers for them. It's very hard to say what to do in this situation.
Well, I don't know if there's anything left after that build up, Taylor, but I don't know if you have it or if you want to echo or expand on any of the short-term issues that Sierra brought up.
I mean, I think Sierra did a great job, covered a lot of the main points I would have mentioned. Yeah, especially as a part-time educator, as someone who freelances at multiple museums, layoffs have been a huge concern for me and my colleagues in museums. I know I was lucky enough to have a job that kept me on and or awarded, like, promised me my hours that were scheduled through June, but a lot of people maybe got hours through March, if even that. So that's been one of my main concerns at this time. And also in museums in general, there's been a big discussion of unionizing. That's been something that's been talked about in the field a lot. And I think that is being amplified with everything that's happening now. Yeah,
Well,
that would be my one addition to Sierra's remarks.
And that certainly is a big addition. Even before, obviously, the pandemic, there was a lot of movement about the union movement and unionizing and organizing in the museum business. Well, I'd like to make this video not feel like it's completely peering into the pit of despair here. So I'm wondering, with some of the issues that you raised, which I think are all valid issues, things related to employment and equitable pay and unionization, I'm wondering what, from your perspective, you might offer as prescriptions for the field, or if you were sitting in the magic seats of power, a director of a museum or the leader of a museum organization, what sorts of things are you thinking about in terms of how the museum world can come to terms with some of these challenges? And so I'll throw that simple question into your lap, Taylor.
Well, just starting off, I would say that this time really lends itself to being able to focus on making programs more accessible. I mean, I know a lot of people have said, oh, well, you know, I was told before by my institution that like we couldn't provide closed captioning for this program, and now suddenly we're able to do it. You hear that a lot.
What a shocker! Right away, you're able to do it.
Students, I mean, I've heard a lot of students saying that about their coursework, that they, you know, asked to be able to do a video version of class, and we're told no. And now suddenly the school is capable of providing that. So I think that that's one really great opportunity. And also I think that the fact that we're all doing everything virtually from home, not necessarily coming together, also makes it possible to bring in a lot of resources that, you know, previously you might have thought you weren't able to reach when you were bringing someone into an institution. So for example, NICMR we had our annual conference. Sierra and I are both board members on NICMR board, New York City Educators Roundtable.
It was a really good conference.
Yes, and so we were able to do the conference virtually. Last minute, we were able to get it together virtually, and that meant that we were also able to access a lot of people and invite a lot of people to attend from out of the state, even outside of the country, which would never have been feasible or possible if we were having an in-person conference.
Absolutely. I think to kind of go on that similar thread, in addition to accessibility, we've gotten to see a lot of really creative community building at this time period between museums. We're seeing institutions finally reach out to community organizations and groups to figure out how they can best serve their community. I know that there are folks who are collaborating with their local food banks or food kitchens to provide activity packs for children or activities there. There are institutions who've created really engaging activity guides that you can download on the internet that are accessible. We're just seeing a lot of really brilliant thinking in terms of, you know, how can we best serve the community? We're also seeing some ways that institutions can better support their employees at this time. I think that Taylor kind of got onto this where, you know, all the things that they said that we couldn't do for years, people are now doing. Like working in museums was often not the job that you could work from home in. And you were often, you know, you had to be a designer or someone very specific to be able to kind of do your work from home. And now, I mean, not every job is doing it comfortably from home, but there is a lot more, there's a lot more flexibility, and I think a lot more folks are seeing that they do not need to be in the office to get work done. Speaking for myself, I think I've seen some of my best work since I've been home. And it's been really great to see how, you know, some institutions have stepped up and really prioritized their employees' like health during this time, and physical, mental, emotional. And it's been upsetting and disheartening to see how others have really failed in that regard. And it's really starting a conversation around supporting your employees, again, getting into the idea of unionization and in work culture at museums.
Since you brought up employees, it seems, well, it seems to me, and perhaps I would imagine you both share that one of the most important aspects of museums are indeed their employees and their volunteers, the people who actually interact with the public and who do the work within the museum. I'd just be curious now as we move into the idea of museums reopening, and some museums have started to reopening around the world and even in the United States, how we can continue prioritizing staff over stuff. Seems like many museums have, been very concerned about their buildings and their collections, which obviously they need to be concerned about those things. But I'd just be curious, Taylor, how can we be a little bit more staff over stuff minded?
One of the things that I've really valued, especially as someone who works part-time and I'm not necessarily getting on email or clocking in every day to do work for either of the institutions where I work, just setting up like weekly or bi-weekly check-ins has been invaluable for me to continue to feel like I'm a part of that community and up to date with what's happening in the institution. The cathedral actually has reopened, not for sightseeing, but just for prayer. So I also work in visitor services at the cathedral, so I have started going back into work. But even though we are back to doing some in-person work at the cathedral, they have still continued to have every other week Zoom meetings so that we can, continue to come together and talk about how we're doing, what we're experiencing when we're going into work, because things are very different from how they were before. So that's one of the big steps that I've felt the impact of, that really helps me feel like I'm a priority and a part of that institution, a part of that community.
Well, I think that notion of communication and ongoing communication is essential. I mean, it was essential before, it's essential going forward. It seems like many of the things you see in the news about problems at museums now, either with employees or the communities they're serving or their approach towards social justice or employment issues, seem to be more than anything a breakdown of communications. So I think yes, yes to communications and building on the things we've learned from this sort of enforced mode of communication or extra communication. Sierra, I don't know if there are other sort of approaches towards when museums reopen that you think they should be cognizant of?
Yeah, I think that Taylor brought up a really strong one, which is communicating with the staff, and not just the full-time staff, like everyone, especially those who are front of house, who are engaging with the visitors, and really listening to them, like listening to what they need to feel safe at their job. I will say that, strong things that I've seen in conversations and webinars that I've been seeing pop up have been really around making sure that we can prioritize the safety of the visitors and the front of house staff. So that's, whether it's like temperature checks for staff and visitors when they get in, providing masks or having masks available for sale, being really clear about that mask policy, having trainings for staff to feel confident in reiterating that staff policy, and making sure that that security, everyone is involved in ensuring the safety of everyone in the building with that policy. We're also seeing really creative ways around getting folks back into the museums as safely as possible. So a lot of institutions have kind of approached either, ticketed options if they didn't have them prior, really limiting the number of folks who can come in. We've also seen, creative floor labeling, hand washing stations, or Purell, like disinfectant stations all over, just really prioritizing like PPE, safety, and just being very clear about the fact that, COVID is not over. We're still very much living in a time we are somehow possibly on the heels of a second wave, and we want to make sure people are as safe as possible if they are coming back to institutions before that comes.
And yet,
And
a
yeah.
museum isn't really just about creating more hand sanitizer stations. That's maybe that's a bigger part of the museum visit now than it was previously, but that's not really the heart of a museum visit. I'm wondering, though, it just occurred to me, now that we've been seeing museums reopening, one thing that strikes me, and I'd just be interested to hear both of your responses to this. One thing that strikes me is that you hear, like, for example, the Louvre reopened or some other large museums reopened, and because they are limiting the attendance or it's time ticketing, people have been consistently saying, wow, it's so great because it's not crowded here. So I'm just wondering what that means for the future of museums. Museums seem very concerned about numbers of people and getting admission revenue, naturally. But visitors seem to like museums that don't feel crowded. So I'm just curious what you both think of that. It just struck me. I mean, it's interesting. It's like I'm thinking of myself. Yeah, I would much rather be at a museum where I sort of feel like I'm not jostling with other people or peering around other people all the time. But I don't know if that makes sense for the business model. So I don't know if that triggers anything with either of you, or if that's just Paul's little side comment.
No, definitely. I think all of us here have been in a large institution. I'm going to say the Met right now, and it's packed. Like, you can barely get in the front to get to wherever you need to be, or just go see what you'd like to see. And that's why there are institutions prior to COVID who used to offer those like empty Met tours, or like early hours or late hours where you could get that exclusive, like, almost one-on-one access with the institution. People loved that. Like, we wanted to have that very intimate access with the collections and with the space. And now you're getting it because it's the safest place for you to be is in a smaller populated institution. But like, we want to make sure that, people are still enjoying the collections. And I guess that with less people, you're getting to see the things that you want to see. I don't know, next time I'll be able to go into an institution, be able to go into a museum and like really walk around freely. But I am enticed by the idea that I could go to one of these like really busy, packed museums and finally get through to some of the exhibitions. I mean, we all know that some of these encyclopedic museums are long and you can't do it all in one trip, but maybe I'll finally make it to some of those places I never used to get to.
And time tickets are definitely a thing that's already been happening with special exhibits in particular. But I do think that, yeah, this experience will possibly make it more likely that other exhibitions, not just special exhibitions, could have time tickets. And I know before the pandemic, there was, I think it was a New York Times article that came out talking about the Mona Lisa and the experience of seeing the Mona Lisa and how it's very disappointing and frustrating, and trying to think of possible solutions that might include time tickets and some sort of, lead up exhibition talking about the work before you get to it.
It's still cool to see the Mona Lisa, to be there in person, but you are with a lot of other people. At least when I visited the Louvre a couple of years ago. The thing is, the museum's so giant, just like the Met. If you go away from the greatest hits part of the collection, even during a very busy day, you could find yourself like basically, oh, I'm one of the only people in this gallery. So yeah. It's interesting. I mean, the other thing that strikes me as interesting is that if visitors keep telling us, we would rather be in museums that don't constantly feel crowded. And if museums want to be respectful and mindful of what visitors are telling them, how do we balance that? You know, how do we balance the notion of how many paying customers can we shove through this space versus what is the quality of the experience? And I think that might be a good segue into wrapping things up, to really focus on the quality of the experience and not just strictly, you know, judging the success of an exhibition or the success of an institution by how many people they push through the doors in a particular month, but rather how strong or positive an experience it was for people when they visited the museum. So I'm going to give you each a magic power to affect the future of museums. If you each had to pick one thing that you think museums should really be keeping front of mind as we move into this brave new future, what would it be and why? So I'll give you a minute to think about that. It's not quite the question of like, what kind of tree would you be and why, or what's your favorite movie and why? But it's sort of like that. But thinking again into the future. It's sort of a variation of the job question. Where do you see yourself in 5 years, or 10 years? Where do you see museums in 5 years or 10 years? And what should have changed already, or what do we hope might have changed? So I don't know, Sierra, you have an idea about that?
I don't know if this will happen in 5 years or even in 10 years, but if I had a magic power of something that I could do for museums, it would be really prioritizing appropriate pay for everyone in the museum, including interns. I think that like if we start paying people at the rates that they would be paid outside of nonprofits, outside of museums, for the work, the expertise, and everything that they have, we will continue to see this kind of ingenuity and brilliance in the field, and it would encourage more folks to be involved. I think that museums are an incredibly fun and exciting field. You do something new every day, new exhibition every cycle. So nothing ever feels stagnant. But I don't know if that's something that's going to come in 5 to 10 years. I can't say that. I know that there's been great strides in the past couple of years, but I don't see that being something that's in like 5 to 10. However, I do see in 5 years a big change in the unpaid internship conversation. I think right now, a lot of people are talking about it. A lot of people are looking at the process and this really like limiting hurdle to get folks in the field that really is dividing folks amongst, you know, who has the privilege to take on unpaid internships in select locations and do certain things for very low or non-existent pay to get to where they need to be, as opposed to, you know, paying people for the time and work and expertise that they bring in. So I really hope that we see more paid internships in 5 years, and I want to see that trickles up or that grows up across the board to being everyone getting paid what they actually deserve.
Well,
that's magic.
Well, I hear exactly what you're saying, but the museum business should be ashamed of itself for having unpaid internships and not listing salaries on jobs and not paying people living wages. So I appreciate that thought, and I just because I'm a troublemaker, I'd frame it more as a demand than a magic hope. I mean, this is really something that is a foundational base level of something that should be happening in museums. But
it's going to take time.
Small steps, unfortunately. Museums move at a glacial pace. I don't need to tell you both. But leaving that aside, we'll give Taylor a chance to wave her magic wand, wave her magic museum wish wand. What do you think there, Taylor?
Well, I was going to say something in a sort of a similar vein. Oh, sorry. Also, my cat has decided to stop her nap and join us.
YouTube bonus.
That's right. So, in line with what Sierra was saying, I would really like to see museums invest in the employees and workers, which includes interns who are actually the ones interacting with the public. And so that means fair pay. It also means more job stability and opportunities to move up within an organization, more job mobility, I guess. And yeah, I think that the pandemic has really shown that that is something that was even less stable than we maybe already thought, knowing that it was already pretty unstable to be a part-time worker in a museum. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think it's clear. Well, two things are clear, I think, from this conversation. One is the ongoing importance and concerns of museum workers related to pay and equitable treatment in museums. But the other thing that's clear to me from this conversation is that since there are folks like you, Sierra, and you, Taylor, that are younger museum professionals who will be carrying on the torch, the flame of the museum profession, I am hopeful for the future of the museum world because there are folks like you who are bringing great things and great ideas forward. So I appreciate you both taking the time today. As we say in YouTube land, if there are links or resources that come to mind, we'll include them in the description below. I know we should definitely, because of both your involvements, give a shout out to NICMER, a very, very good museum organization with its very cognizant of its members, and an organization that insists that job postings include salary ranges. I'll just mention that to continue the thread. And we'll, if there are other links or resources related to our conversation, Sierra or Taylor, that you want to provide, that would be great. So again, thanks very much. I appreciate you both taking the time today.
Thanks, Paul. This was great.
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Take care.